The following podcast is non-profit and is based on the IGCSE history curriculum. Welcome to another episode of my podcast. Today will be the second part of me speaking about the First Gulf War. To begin this part, what happened in the Persian Gulf War? One of the events was the UN Security Resolution 678. The ultimatum was that if Saddam's forces did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, military force would be used. Operation Desert Shield soon commenced. The main members of the international coalition force sent to liberate Iraq was the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and it began on January 16, 1991. After Saddam's forces did not withdraw from Kuwait. The US rushed troops into Saudi Arabia when Iraq first invaded Kuwait to prevent a possible attack. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991. It was a massive bombing campaign using the latest American military technology, which targeted Iraqi aircraft, anti-air defenses, oil refineries, communication lines, weapon factories, bridges, and roads. The most important forms of weapons used were stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and smart bombs. This operation lasted 1 month. Operation Desert Sabre began on February 24, 1991. It lasted just 4 days, until February 28, 1991. The main tactics deployed were ground forces. A ceasefire was signed. The terms of the Gulf War ceasefire were as follows. Firstly, a territorial term was that Iraq had to recognize Kuwait's sovereignty. Secondly, an economic term was that Iraq had to pay reparations. Thirdly, a military term was that Iraqi aircraft could not enter the no-fly zones established in the north and south of Iraq. These were established to prevent his own people from attacks. Fourthly, another military term was that Iraq had to comply with a new UN Security Council Resolution 687, which was to destroy all WMDs and comply with the UN weapons inspections. Finally, in terms of the military and economy, until all WMDs were destroyed, economic sanctions were imposed on Iraq by the UN. Let's discuss the important question. Who suffered more, Saddam or his people? On the one hand, Saddam suffered heavily from the war. Firstly, he was forced to comply with UN weapons inspections carried out by UNSCOM, UN Special Commission. These inspections led to the destruction of his biological and chemical weapons, as well as putting an end to his nuclear weapons program. The Gulf War lasted little more than 2 months. During this time, coalition forces destroyed much of Saddam's army, with around 25,000 Iraqi soldiers killed in the fighting. This was a humiliating defeat for Saddam. Thirdly, his crushing defeat had led to him becoming increasingly isolated. He was no longer respected or feared in the Arab world, and Iraq was no longer a leading power in the Gulf. On the other hand, Saddam's people suffered more. Firstly, the UN placed economic sanctions on Iraq. These sanctions led to shortages of food, clean water, and medicine. They are thought to have caused the deaths of around 500,000 Iraqi civilians. Secondly, Saddam faced increased opposition in Iraq after the war. Uprisings by the Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south of Iraq were brutally suppressed. This repression led to the deaths of around 100,000 Iraqi civilians. Thirdly, the UN's Oil for Food program was created to alleviate the problems caused by the UN sanctions on Iraq. However, the Iraqi government abused the program by taking much of the money for themselves. Therefore, the Iraqi people received very little humanitarian aid. My fourth point is that the war caused $256 billion worth of damage to the infrastructure of Iraq. Oil refineries, power stations, roads, and bridges were destroyed by coalition strikes. This led to poor transport and shortages of food and electricity. Finally, the coalition bombing campaign of Iraqi cities such as Baghdad and led to the deaths of around 3,500 Iraqi civilians. To conclude, why did the war only last 7 months? Firstly, key countries and many armed forces invaded Iraq, and outnumbered their army. While 30,000 Iraqi soldiers died, only 292 Allied forces died. Secondly, the Allies used many different operations and tactics to overcome the Iraqi army. Thirdly, the Allies were able to use new advanced US technology to destroy key military bases and communication links in Iraq. This is the end of the podcast. Thank you for listening.